Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's weekly video conference. This is our 30th since we launched on Zoom in late March to track the pandemic. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Today, our topic is immigration, the hot button issue of the 2016 elections, but ignored to a great extent in this presidential campaign, certainly not mentioned in the presidential debates. Our speakers are Ali Noorani, President and CEO of the National Immigration Forum and host of the podcast Only in America. Alex Nowrasteh, Immigration Policy Analyst at the Cato Institute, and Juan Escalante, a DACA recipient and leader in the Dreamer movement. On behalf of Ethnic Media Services, a special thanks to today's speakers for joining us, to our veteran reporters, Pilar Marrero and Sunita Sarabji, who coordinate our weekly Friday briefings, and to the dozens of news reporters who join us each week and report on the briefings. Thanks also to our interpreters today, Oscar Artete and Jackie No, who will provide simultaneous interpreting in Spanish and Korean. We will be sending a video of today's call along with collateral material in the afternoon, including a link to a new study by the Migration Policy Institute on public attitudes towards immigration. Now I'm turning the conference over to our moderator and reporter, excellent reporter, Pilar Marrero. Thanks, Pilar.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here today. It's a nerve-wracking time right before the election, but we wanted to speak about immigration today because this is an issue that is close to many of our communities, and we haven't really heard it too much during this campaign. And we have three people who can really give us an idea of what's going on, what could go on after the election is over. So the first speaker is Ali Noorani, who is, as Sandy introduced him, a Executive Director of the National Immigration Forum, and he will give us an idea of what's happened with the immigration issue and where are we right now and what can we expect after the election. That's a big topic, Ali. Please go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you, Pilar. Thank you, Sandy. And it's really just wonderful to see everybody, even if it's just via the screen. And we're at the National Immigration Forum are incredibly grateful for all the work that you're doing to not just keep the community engaged and informed, but really to advance a constructive narrative and conversation about immigrants and immigration in the United States. So I thought I would start with a couple of data points. And both of these data points are from the Public Religion Research Institute, which is one of the most, and in my opinion, one of the most effective research organizations really looking at American attitudes. And every year for the last, I would say 10, 15 years, they've done an American Values Survey. And what I like about PRRI is that they look at the range of issues, but they try to understand the public in a way that's much more than just kind of Democrat versus Republican. And they really try to understand kind of where specific religious groups are, for example. So my point is that
Ali, could I just interrupt you for a moment? It's so important that our interpreters can track you. If you could speak a little more slowly. Sorry to interrupt.
No. Thank you. Thank you very much for reminding me. I feel like I'm just talking to myself sometimes when I'm just speaking to a screen, so I just talk very quickly. I guess I talk to myself a lot, but that's another panel. In 2016, the American Values Survey done by Public Religion Research Institute found that, quote, no issue in 2016 is viewed by more Americans as important today than terrorism, with 70% saying it is a critical issue to them personally. And back then in 2016, over 4 in 10 Americans, almost 50% of Americans, said immigration was an issue of critical importance. So Trump, over the course of his election campaign in 2015 and 16, really conflated the idea of terrorism and immigration in the minds of many, many, many voters across the country. Then they did a survey in 2020. They just released, I would say, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. In 2020, PRI found that terrorism as a defining issue had dropped to 45%, had gone from 70% in 2016 to 45% in 2020. What's important to voters now is the coronavirus pandemic at 60%. And then, kind of issues around the economy and jobs. So I think one reason why immigration has not been a kind of a driving factor for the campaign so far is because Trump, quite frankly, and politicians overall have not had the opportunity to conflate the kind of very visceral and emotional story that energizes many people. But I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. In 2018, I would argue that a significant number of suburban voters ended up parting ways with the Republican Party because of the child separation crisis along the border. So I think another reason why Trump has not been talking about immigration as much is that he realizes that in 2018, it was a losing issue for voters. Now, in the last 48 hours, we've seen an uptick in conversation or rhetoric from the Trump campaign around immigration. Stephen Miller has done a few interviews over the last few days, speaking to continuing to cut legal immigration, continuing to slash the refugee admissions cap. So the Trump campaign is trying to kind of gin up people. Now the Biden campaign on their end, they have, I would argue, kind of stayed away from the issue, other than kind of speaking to DACA or Dreamers, kind of very broad brush comments. But also in the last 48 hours, they've released a video speaking very specifically to the child separation crisis, and calling for and committing to a federal task force to reunite the 545 children that remain separated. So I guess the question here is, what does this mean moving forward? And what are the stories that we need to be kind of thinking about? Now, so much of the debate in the next 4 or 5 days is going to be defined, I think, increasingly by the left versus the right, which is not surprising. But I think the more interesting and almost more important story that needs to be told is the role of immigrants and immigration in small town America. And that's either kind of rural parts of the country or suburban parts of the country. So, a place, there's a lot of talk these days about Texas, right? And this massive turnout in Texas is coming from voters, Latino and white voters in Texas. But as you probably know, in Texas, it's Fort Bend County in Texas, which is actually one of the most diverse counties in Texas, and has this massive Asian population and South Asian population. So telling those kinds of stories of how the Asian community and communities kind of beyond the Latino community are politically engaging, or contributing to the response and recovery to COVID-19, I think are really, really important stories to tell. It was just, the previous Zoom call I was on was at a conference in Iowa, where, a small town like Storm Lake, Iowa, is one of the only small towns in Iowa that is seeing growth in population, and that growth in population is coming from immigrants and immigration. So there are just so many important stories to be telling outside of the cities, whether in the suburbs or in the rural areas. One other thing that I would, touch on here is that, it's important to see kind of, and I would say really in the final days going into the election, the environment right after the election, and kind of going through a transition period, whether it's a second term or Biden administration is I think that the debate is going to get increasingly racialized. And we've seen this over and over again where the president very explicitly or through his campaign explicitly or not have really tried to racialize the debate overall, and quite frankly have brought an element of white supremacy to the immigration debate that I think is we find alarming, and I'm sure everybody on this call in your respective communities find alarming. So we did a call with Elizabeth Newman, who was the Assistant Secretary for Homeland Security for Threat Prevention and Counterterrorism for President Trump. So she came from President Trump's DHS. And you can find this webinar that we did with her, a web discussion that we did with her, somebody from the ADL, and then Mike Signer, who used to be mayor of Charlottesville. And what Elizabeth said is that, and she tied a very clear line between, what happened in El Paso, the massacre in El Paso, to what the president has said. She made very clear that the elements of white supremacy are deep, and they're being promoted, again, kind of explicitly or implicitly by the administration. So I guess what I would say is that I would encourage you to go to that webinar, listen to what Elizabeth said, and her expertise and the message I think is really important, just in terms of being able to kind of push back on this narrative in different ways. So let me pause there. I know we've got two great other panelists, much smarter than me, to go next.
I have a question, and we have more questions in the chat for you, Ali. But one thing that I have heard anecdotally is our Latinos who say, yeah, I'm going to vote Democrat because of Trump, what Trump has done to immigration. And, you can argue the Trump administration has been one of the most anti-immigrant, not only undocumented immigration, but legal immigration. They've curtailed it in ways that we never thought possible. I mean, including to students, to business people, to people looking to visit. But these Latinos that I talk to, they feel doubtful about a Biden administration because the obvious reasons, right? We all were here in 2008. I covered the Obama campaign. I remember I talked to Obama many times, and he said he was going to do immigration reform, and he did not. So they tie Biden with Obama, and they say he's not going to do anything. Do you think? So why do you think the Democrats have not seized on the opportunity to show how anti-immigrant and how terrible the Trump administration has been, not just for immigrants, but for non-immigrants, for legal immigration, and done more an aggressive, work on that?
So I think I think both Democrats and advocates, we're a nonpartisan organization. We do probably more work on a day-to-day basis with Republicans than with Democrats. So let me kind of reframe that. I think as advocates, we have missed an opportunity to build the coalition of voters and policymakers who see immigration as a priority. And what I mean by that is, for us, for example, we do a lot of work with conservative and moderate faith, law enforcement, business leaders. And we just find that by bringing them into the conversation alongside the immigrant community, then a policymaker, whether it is somebody like potentially President Biden or a Republican or Democrat in Congress, they realize that the need for constructive immigration reforms is not limited to demands coming from the immigrant community. The demands coming from the immigrant community are being echoed and supported by a broad spectrum of voters, from Democratic to Independent to Republican. So I think if we do have an opportunity in the years ahead, we have to learn the lessons of the past and realize that the coalition that's necessary to pressure a Pelosi, a Biden, or a Schumer to actually move something forward and to spend the political capital necessary to move something forward requires that those of us on the outside build these much broader and inclusive coalitions that are, still are being led by and defined by the immigrant community, the immigrant voice, but are bringing along the rest of the country. And we don't do ourselves a disservice by, kind of siloing our demands.
You have a question for Fatma Bakit? Fatma?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, how are you? What are your expectations after the release of the election result, whatever Trump won or not? Will the situation remain the same with regard to the immigration and to the laws he's been issued? Or do you expect the situation to be changed after the election?
There we go. So I think with a, look, if it is a second term of a Trump administration, we will continue to see cuts to legal immigration. I mean, over the course of his time in office, we've seen a cut by over 50% since COVID. In essence, immigration has been almost completely closed. I think with a Trump second term, we'll see cuts to legal immigration. We will see continued attacks on DACA recipients. Those with temporary protected status will lose their status, and we'll see 400,000 individuals and their families being forced to return to their home country. So I think the list of things that a Trump administration will do to reduce immigration, take away whatever rights are left for immigrants, that's the reality that we'll face. I think with the Biden administration, on day one, we would hope that he would extend DACA protections, extend TPS protections, but also really try to think about and try to move the stabilization of legal residence and citizenship for TPS and DACA recipients, as well as legalization of the undocumented essential workforce that's contributing to the response and recovery to COVID-19. And there will be an opportunity at the beginning of a Biden administration to ensure that the immigrant workforce that is part of the essential workforce can enjoy full legal status and a path to citizenship.
Henrietta Burroughs has a question.
Yes, thanks so much, Pilar. You mentioned that we need to learn from history, and I'm wondering whenever we do, when will we? But how do you explain, given all that Trump has said, that there are Latino groups calling themselves Latinos for Trump?
Well, I'm not going to say that we represent or I represent the Latino community at all. I would say, in our work with conservatives and moderates and, even conservative Latinos, I do think that, there is at times a belief that the candidate who is louder, meaner, is the candidate that a community will want to support. And I think that, whether it's other more moderate Republicans or, Democrats, there's an opportunity over time to, make the case that, our candidates for president or any other elected office, they do not need to be loud, mean, and, make the case that other people are less than them.
One last question before we move in. Do you expect Donald Trump, if he gets a second term, to push redefining citizenship or birthright citizenship? And also we've heard that he's looking to denaturalize people. Do you expect any of this to happen?
What worries us the most, quite frankly, is efforts that a second term for Trump will to really chip away at the protections that the immigrant community has under the 14th Amendment, which in essence, says that we should all be treated equally. So my read on this is that some of, for example, the efforts for the census count, to say that the undocumented should not be, part of the census count, from my perspective, are the early steps to making the case that the 14th Amendment does not apply to the immigrant community, which has an impact on the census, on birthright citizenship, and even potentially Filer versus Doe and the undocumented immigrant children who are in elementary schools. So I do think that there, if we are faced with a second term, there will be a steady stream of whether they are, executive orders or litigation that really chip away at equal protection.
Thank you so much, Ali. Please stay around if you can. And then I now welcome Alex Noraste. Alex, welcome. And I'm always very interested in all the data that Alex puts out from the Cato Institute. He's a data guy, and he goes on Fox regularly to talk about this data and kind of present, the logical, rational point of view. Alex, welcome.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me. I almost wish Ali could keep going because I always learn so much from him. But I'll step in and try to fill his enormous shoes with my small feet. So there's a couple different issues I want to talk about. Many of them are more sort of relevant now than before. I'm going to talk about deaths in detention facilities, ICE detention facilities, some of the changes to the refugee and asylum system, some of the changes to foreign worker categories, with focus particularly on the H-1B visa, and then sort of end with what Trump has basically done to the legal immigration system, especially this year, which is essentially shut it down. So when it comes to deaths in detention, we've seen a sharp increase in the year 2020, the fiscal year, which ended at the end of September, of an increase of up to 21 people who have died in immigrant detention, which is up from 8 people over the 2019 fiscal year. And this is over a time, by the way, when the number of people admitted to ICE detention facilities is much lower than it was in earlier years. So for instance, in 2019, 511,000 people were admitted to immigration detention. In 2020 fiscal year, it was only about 177,000. So you have a much smaller pool of people going into immigrant detention facilities, but a much larger number of people who are dying. So much so that the death rate in ICE immigration detention in 2020 was 11.8 per 100,000 admissions, which is almost 7 times higher than what it was in 2019, and the second highest that we have on record. The only other year that was slightly higher was in 2004, which is right when they started to actually keep statistics on the number of people who died in immigrant detention facilities. Now, the deaths in ICE detention facilities on average per year were highest during the George W. Bush administration. There were 91 total deaths, 2003 to 2008, for a rate of about 6.4 per 100,000. But deaths fell rapidly from 2004 onward. 2004 was just like a terrible year for people dying in immigration detention. So they started to improve dramatically after 2004. During the Obama administration, the death rate continued to fall to 2.3 per 100,000. And we've seen it go up under the Trump administration. It's 3.6 per 100,000. So we're seeing the number of deaths increase as a percentage of those who are admitted. And I want to say one of the main reasons the numbers have fallen this year is because the administration beginning in March started to rely on what's called Title 42, which is a legal category that allows them, in the case of a pandemic or public health emergency, to basically close the borders. Anybody apprehended is just turned back immediately to where they came from, or just pushed over the border into Mexico, even if they came from another country, without any kind of due process, without anything like that. So the only reason why these admission numbers into the ICE detention facilities are as low as they are is because they're just expelling unlawful immigrants and other border crossers immediately, without even giving them any due process or any chance to apply for asylum. So that's the reason why those numbers, part of the reason why they look as bad as they do, but no matter how you slice it, no matter how you dice it, the deaths in detention facilities are up. Now, when it comes to the refugee and asylum system, I have some pretty, of course, depressing news. And that is, compared to 2016, the number of refugees admitted in 2019 were down about 85%. And the numbers this year are down even further. And next year, the administration has slated to reduce them. So when they were down from about 85,000 in 2016, last year they were about 11,000. And we suspect that it'll be even lower next year. And when they talk about these different refugee caps that they put in place, last year's there was 18,000, they let in about 11,000. They always under admit. So even if they say they're going to admit 15,000 or 12,000 or 10,000, you can guarantee the number that they actually will admit will be lower than that. So when they have these refugee caps, that's like the uppermost bound for this administration in terms of admissions. If we all remember well, the main justification for reducing asylum, ending these programs, was the national security fear. It was the fear that refugees, particularly Muslim refugees from the Syrian civil war or elsewhere, were a very serious terrorist threat to the United States. But if you take a look at the numbers, you take a look at the number of people killed on US soil from 1975 through the end of 2017 who were admitted as refugees, there were only 3 people killed in terrorist attacks committed by a refugee on US soil. And all of them were in the late 1970s. So that works out to an annual chance of being murdered in a refugee terrorist attack at about 1 in 3.8 billion per year. Very, small chance. It's not a consolation to the victims, of course, but it's a very small chance. And you compare that to the benefits of letting refugees in, and it just doesn't compare. To put that sort of in perspective, the annual chance of being murdered just in a normal homicide during that time period is about 1 in 20,000 per year. So it's just a vastly different comparison. Now, to asylum, I'm afraid it's even more depressing. The government has virtually shut down the asylum system on the southwest border and put in place numerous restrictions and legal loops that asylees have to jump through in order to get asylum, most spectacularly having to wait in Mexico through the MPP program for their court dates. So you have sort of this situation where there are essentially refugee camps on the US border in Mexico. Of course, all that is a huge sham that is intended to raise the costs and make it more difficult for people to gain asylum. Now, moving on to the foreign worker categories, what the administration has done here is that in response to COVID-19, the government has essentially shut down every guest worker visa program in the United States, with the exception of the H-2A program, which is for seasonal agricultural workers who are almost, the vast majority are from Mexico. Over, I believe it's over 95% are from Mexico. So those are the only types of workers who are really being admitted in now. This is enormously destructive to the US economy. One example of this is, many of us are able to keep our jobs because we're working remotely. And we're able to do that because of IT services provided. We're able to have this Zoom call because of IT services, right? And if we didn't have these great services, it'd be much more difficult for us to work remotely. And what we've seen is that H-1B workers, the majority of whom work in computer occupations, many of them in IT services, have substantially lowered the price of supplying IT services to the US economy. And as a result, millions of Americans likely are able to keep working because we have access to the skills provided by these workers. But it's not just high skilled workers either. To sort of make it personal for a lot of people, the government did end the J-1 visa for au pairs, which is, a temporary visa for somebody to come in from abroad to live in your home and to take care of your children. And, this isn't a huge visa. It's not used by a huge number of people, but it is overwhelmingly used by higher skilled women. who are mothers, who have jobs and careers. And this provides a great opportunity for them to both be mothers as well as to work. And the government has essentially ended this program. So, if my goal, and it's not my goal, but if my goal were to basically keep a lot of high-skilled American women out of the labor force, this would be one way to do it. One of the many policies that one would pursue in order to do that. Now, the government has also introduced in early October a series of regulations that would raise the wages for H-1B workers. And H-1B workers are high-skilled temporary workers in specialty occupations. And the goal of raising these wages is to essentially keep most of them, as many of them as possible, out of the United States, in a fruitless attempt to raise wages for American workers in occupations where wages are already increasing. Now, what's interesting is this regulation, they mess up a lot of the data when they calculate it. They compare different data sets that are incomparable. So they'll take a look at like how much people make in computer occupations in one survey, which is collected in a whole different way from another survey, but then they'll take that wage and apply it to a different survey, and then they'll apply that to a different survey to try to get their magical number of what the wages should be. And as we know from governments messing around with wages and prices, this is all going to end up in a giant mess. So what we basically see is if the government is able to get this regulation through in time, which it seems like they will be able to, it will massively decrease the number of skilled immigrants who are able to come to the United States and force a lot of H-1B workers who are here currently to either change jobs or in some cases to have to leave the country. And the H-1B visa is for most people who get an employment-based green card, sort of one of their early steps in the United States to be able to live and work permanently. And sort of finally and most depressingly, the number of green cards that are being issued by the Trump administration in the second half of 2020. And these are green cards issued to people who are abroad. So I'm not talking about people who are already in the United States and get their green cards. This isn't much affected by that. But if you're abroad and you're waiting for your green card, in the second half of 2020, the number issued dropped by 92%, which is the single largest decline in such a short period of time that we've seen in American history. It is greater than the decline after the government closed its open borders policy with Europe in the 1920s. It's greater than the decline that we saw at the beginning of the Great Depression. It's greater than the decline that we saw at the beginning of World War II or World War I, even. So this is sort of a massive decline. And the government, the Trump administration, when they announced this, they said they were doing it for two reasons. The first reason that they didn't emphasize much was due to COVID, to try to stop the spread of disease internationally. But the second reason and the main reason is to try to protect the American labor market, to try to keep jobs for Americans in this sort of misguided, economically illiterate attempt to prevent job losses caused by the virus. So what I suspect is if President Trump gets reelected, he will keep these bans in place for as long as he possibly can, because it ticks a lot of boxes that he wants to achieve, cutting legal immigration. And unfortunately, since the ruling in the case Trump v. Hawaii in 2018, we don't see many practical limits legally as the law currently stands for the president on his ability to cut legal immigration. So we're really in this sort of very worrisome environment with a very few legal checks on what the administration can do in terms of issuing visas to people who are abroad. As much as I complain about immigration law and how terrible it is and restrictive it is, and how much it hurts America's national interests, immigrants, Americans, everybody, the only thing worse than that is this sort of unilateral control in the office of the president to cut immigration wherever he wants for whatever reason he wants. And that's the legal situation that we are in now. So I worry for the future that the debate will be about immigration instead of about Congress and changing the law and operating, you know, in a representative democracy where we debate things in Congress and pass laws, that we're going to a situation where it's basically the president issuing orders with very little oversight. So that's sort of a broader institutional complaint. It's not entirely confined to immigration. It affects trade and lots of other areas. But in immigration, I think, is the area where you can point to the president's authority being very wide, and unfortunately, according to many recent court rulings, without any obvious limits. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Alex. That was very informative as usual. Before we go to questions in the chat, I have a couple of questions for you. One, do you have any evidence in the data that the zero tolerance policy at the border that separated so many kids and prevented thousands of unaccompanied minors from coming into a country actually lessened the flow of migrants escaping from Central America, Venezuela, Syria, Africa, and other countries? And secondly, do you have any evidence that people illegally in the United States have self-deported because of the Trump administration policies? I mean, both of these were supposedly aims or objectives of Stephen Miller and Donald Trump.
Yeah, thank you. Good questions. On the first one about whether the Trump administration's policies affected those showing up at the border, it's not just what President Trump did to asylum, you know, for people once they reach the United States, but it's also the massive pressure his administration put on the Mexican government to act as sort of, you know, forward immigration enforcers for the United States. I think that likely had a fairly large impact. I think the U.S. Trump administration's policies and trying to make people wait in Mexico for their court cases, I think that obviously had some kind of impact as well. It's hard to tell which one had a bigger impact at which time, but I think it's fair to say that both of those definitely did. But one of the things that had a perverse incentive is that I believe it was in 2018, right when the child separation crisis was beginning. Right before then, the government said you can't ask for asylum at a lot of these ports of entry along the border, which gave the perverse incentive for folks who are asylum seekers to then enter unlawfully across, not through a port of entry, because that was a way for them to claim asylum. So this is sort of like government whack-a-mole, and you can see it everywhere. It's like they have a problem. They try to solve the problem by closing off the legal pathway. And what happens is that incentivizes people to choose the relatively less legal pathway to claim legal asylum. And that's sort of what happened. So I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration policies have had an effect. They have diminished the number of people who are coming, but it's hard to say by how much. It's hard to say how much the Mexican government bears the responsibility for much of that happened. But I think it's fair to say that there definitely was an effect. In terms of self-deportation, it's fairly complicated when you take a look at the government data and the current population survey, which they release every year, sort of a mini census that they do every year, along with some other mini censuses that they do. And what we do see is that you know, there has been an uptick in people returning to their home countries, and a lot of those probably are unauthorized immigrants. But there's also been a more substantial sort of decline in new immigrants coming into the United States, both lawfully and probably unlawfully as well. So it's sort of this mixed effect. So I can say it probably has had some effect, but fairly small on the net numbers for the unauthorized immigrant population. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting is the Trump administration, despite all of its efforts to deport people from the interior of the United States, and despite a lot of dramatic and horrible stories about this happening, has not actually been that successful at it. You know, compared to the first term of the Obama administration, these numbers are pretty low. And that's not because Trump isn't trying. I mean, he's trying harder than he can, but I think it's because many major American cities and governors across the country, you know, from California to Illinois, New York, you know, basically every major American city, with the exception of the cities in Texas and some in Florida and Arizona, are not cooperating with ICE. They have become sanctuary cities, sanctuary states, and sanctuary jurisdictions. And that movement started during the Obama administration in response to those heavy enforcement actions, but it has only increased dramatically under the Trump administration. So despite his best efforts, and despite his deployment of ICE officers domestically, and despite his sort of trying to bully jurisdictions across the country to go along with him, he hasn't been that successful, thankfully.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I'm going to go to my third speaker, Juan Escalante. Juan, welcome. And can you please talk to us about the future of programs such as DACA, TPS, and immigration reform? What is the expectation on that front?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. I wanted to just obviously kind of give a little bit of my background, and thank you to the other speakers for their knowledge and introductions here. As Pilar and others have mentioned, I am a DACA recipient. I've been working on immigration issues for the past 15 or so years, when prior to the DACA program, I discovered my lack of immigration status upon graduating from high school. That was back in 2007. And thanks to the DACA program, I've been able to continue my advocacy efforts, as well as returning to school and obtaining a master's degree, which is kind of like the story that we see across the board from 700,000 beneficiaries of this program. For the past number of years, DACA recipients have been contributing to the United States, not just through their taxes and their labor, but have been some of the most committed individuals to ensuring that they represent, what is best of America, their families, their culture, and what they can become if they're given a chance to adjust their immigration status. Unfortunately, what we've seen from this administration has been nothing short of continued attacks on the DACA program. This past July, we saw a victory at the Supreme Court that allowed the DACA program to remain. But unfortunately, what we've seen now is that the administration has all intents of continuing to shrink the program to make it even harder for people to access it. As we're speaking right now, some of you may be familiar with the fact that the administration, through the Department of Homeland Security and ultimately through USCIS, has issued guidance to cut the program in half, basically rendering a benefit that is now active for only 1 year instead of 2 years, as it originally was stated, which means that the increase in fees, $495, will now be doubled, which is a significant barrier for a lot of beneficiaries, especially in rural communities, and especially those who are currently navigating the higher education system, as I once was. I say all this to kind of paint the backdrop that what we've seen thus far is this relentless attack against this particular community, short of 1 million individuals, but also no indication that there is any credible plan that wouldn't be tied to enforcement by the Trump administration or by the Republican Party thus far. We have seen a majority of, we've seen a variety of different bills come and go, but none have essentially been given the green light to kind of circumvent a lot of the roadblocks that we've seen, not just from the administration over in the executive at the White House, but also in the Senate, where Mitch McConnell has not given hearing to some of the other pieces of legislation, such as the Dream and Promise Act. That is obviously particularly concerning for myself, and also for a lot of people who have worked on this issue for a variety of different issues. For a variety of different periods of time. And I think what the panorama looks ahead for the DACA program specifically, at least in my view, is under a second term of the Trump administration, is the potential repeal of the program, with the threat that if the country or the Democratic Party does not accept higher immigration restrictions, that this program will ultimately go away, and the individuals currently benefiting under it could be subjected to deportation. Similarly, we may see perhaps other proposals that include baking in the DACA program into whatever plans, nefarious or otherwise, the administration may have to try to pass it through Congress and try to essentially use it as a bargaining chip for any other number of policy issues that they may try to add to their policy agenda during a second term. Again, and I cannot overstate this enough, because it feels that every time that the administration remotely says anything that is digestible on immigration, it tends to mean that people try to essentially turn the other way and figure out whether or not the president is going to flip on the issue, or if they're going to be kind to immigrants. And what we've seen for the past 4 years is anything but. There's really not been any sort of indication, and I myself as a beneficiary of this program have absolutely no hope that this president or his advisors or his allies in Congress will try to do anything but continue to attack the DACA program and the beneficiaries therefore. On TPS, I'm a little less familiar than on the DACA program. I will add a couple of things. Obviously, TPS is of great concern, and I'll defer to some of the other speakers in here, namely because under a second term of the Trump administration, what we can see is essentially, pending dates that continue to hang on the calendars of a lot of people across America who understand that this program has essentially been wound down without any sort of extension or reauthorization. Which puts a lot of people in a very difficult situation should this president be reelected and successfully terminate this program. Simultaneously, we also see a lot of back and forth, and it cannot be called anything but political theater when it comes to the authorization of TPS for Venezuelans, such as myself. My family and I arrived to the United States in the year 2000. From Caracas, Venezuela. And I think what you have seen thus far in Miami and in Florida is essentially this courting of the small yet loud voting bloc of the Venezuelan American community, with little to no, with some promise, but nothing really grounded in policy or reality that points to the potential authorization of the TPS program, given the treatment of the program as a whole by other countries. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops under a second, Trump administration. Again, I'll attach my personal view. I don't think that it's a way forward, and anybody who believes that this president will do good by promises on immigration without trying to attach more restrictions definitely needs to read up on the past 4 years. Of policy that we have seen from the White House and from Congress. I'll end, by just kind of stating the other side. Obviously, Joe Biden has essentially done a couple of things over the past number of months and even so weeks that indicate a much more different approach than the one that the Trump administration would take under a second term. Number one is essentially the continuation of the DACA program, which to a lot of people sounds like a good thing. However, it does not, take us out of the fact that there would be likely additional legal challenges by means of other attorney generals or potentially red states to attack the program or continue to attack the program. So it would essentially put the new administration potentially on a position to try to pass something through Congress. What that would look like, I'd rather not dwell on speculation. And simultaneously is essentially the continuation of the TPS program and granting TPS for Venezuelans. It does not, and I think that this is worth noting, the fact that the Obama and the Biden administration back, from 2008 to 2012 really had a very tragic record and destructive record in immigration when it comes to deportations. And it was somewhat refreshing seeing the former vice president acknowledging, that record and trying to apologize for it. only time will tell what a Biden administration will ultimately end up doing. But the contrast couldn't be clearer, given that it was, under the Obama administration in 2012 that the DACA program was, conjured into existence. So I think that we're obviously at a crossroads when it comes to this issue. As Ali and Alex have mentioned, things definitely are looking much more difficult for the immigrant communities that we have spoken about, much more so obviously under a second term under President Donald Trump than if a change of administration were to happen. And I wouldn't be surprised if the amount of rule changing legislation and beyond eats up a lot of their time and political capital, and it'll be telling where exactly the priority will fall, so that we don't have to relive ever, the horror of having family separation or children ripped away from their parents, and some of the other, very damaging occurrences that we've seen in years past.
Thank you, Juan. I want to open it for questions to all three of our speakers. And we have a question from Michael Fitzgerald. Michael, are you there? And please ask your question about the lame session or whatever it is after the election if Trump loses. Are you there, Michael? Okay. So he says, in the event of a Trump loss, are there specific things his administration will try to push through before he leaves office in January 2021? Anyone? A speculation.
So I'll say something. If you want to speculate or take a look at a potential roadmap for that, NBC had a recent report out about White House advisor Stephen Miller's sort of dream list of policies he wants to accomplish in the second term. So I would take a look at that for some indications of what they might want to do. The thing to keep in mind is that it takes a while to craft executive orders and regulations in a way that pass muster. We've seen some of the recent H-1B regulations have been very poorly written from a legal standpoint. It took them 3 tries with the travel ban in 2017 to get it right legally, for instance. So they probably won't be as successful in the long term, but I would look to that document as sort of a guide to try to figure out if they're going to do anything in the lame duck session, what would it be?
Okay, a lot of questions around something that we've already talked about, which is what assurances we have that Joe Biden will actually follow through some of his promises on immigration, and what's the path for the immigrant rights groups and just the immigrant community in general to push this. It's not enough to just elect the president. We know that, right? What is your advice, each of you, for how to push a prospective Biden administration, if it occurs, to actually make good on immigration? Ali?
I would say, look, let me put it this way. Every time I get the opportunity to talk to someone who is, a former cabinet secretary, a member of Congress, a CEO, and I ask them, okay, and they'll do the conversation because, they're in favor of immigrants and immigration reform. And I'll always ask them more or less the same question. I will ask them, okay, how does immigration come up in your circle, right? Whether they're a policymaker or a CEO or somebody who's kind of running in fairly influential circles. To a person, they will say it doesn't come up, and I ask why, and I get the same answer every time. It's because people don't feel like there's a solution. So I think going forward, we have to think of every creative way possible to not just reset the way that the public understands the value and the contributions of immigrants and immigration, but also resets the way that policymakers understand how we need to get to immigration solutions. So, and that can be in all kinds of different ways, right? It could be, making sure that immigration issues are included in other legislative vehicles. It could be, like I was saying earlier, really focusing on telling the stories of immigrants who are contributing in suburban and rural parts of the country. But I think that one of our biggest challenges and even opportunities moving forward is to get policymakers to think of the immigration debate just differently, and get them to help them see it as a consensus issue, as opposed to a deeply polarizing or partisan issue. Because if Trump loses, it doesn't mean that Trumpism goes away. There will still be that faction of Americans who are scared of immigrants and immigration. But there are going to be there's going to be a massive number of conservatives and moderates who are not in the same place. So how do we, again, kind of help policymakers see that this is not the immigration debate of 2013. There's something just very different that's happening right now in the United States.
Thank you, Ali. Alex, do you have anything to say about this?
It is tempting to sort of get a lot of executive actions and then want to sort of relax and feel like you've achieved a lot. Lasting reform, I think, means, the positive reform means that we need legal changes passed by Congress, signed into law, that create a much better immigration system, that allow those who are here, who are unlawful immigrants, to be legal, but also restricts the president's power to reduce immigration in the future. I think that we should be thinking about what types of reforms are necessary so that if a future president who has the same positions as Donald Trump is elected, what types of laws need to be enacted so that the damage that that person can do while in power are limited. So we need to think about it systematically in terms of the system as a whole, and to think about the permanent or just the legal changes that need to be made to the law and push for that. In addition, I just want to say that what Ali said is absolutely right. We got to find ways to work with the folks who are conservatives and Republicans and moderates who agree with us on a lot of these issues, and they are out there. I don't think we're ever going to convince the Stephen Millers of the world, but there are a lot of people in the middle, and we need to identify them. We need to be nice to them. We need to listen to their concerns and try to appeal to their worldview, because I think immigration is something that will benefit all Americans. I think it's consistent with what liberals, conservatives, and moderates want for this country. We just need to make that case, and we need to make it in a way that brings people in rather than pushes them away.
Thank you, Alex. Juan?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard to add to both of what Alex and Ali just said. I will say that having lived on the impacted side of the fight in terms of being aware that these policy decisions and the people in office who are coming in next week or being sworn in January will have a profound impact on the life of 11 million people plus. And not just that, we also have to be essentially pragmatic in terms of the things that we start proposing and trying to codify into law through Congress and eventually signed by the new president. We cannot, as advocates, repeat the mistakes of the past, where we attempt, to pass one thing, the policy window closes, and then we end up with nothing. We need to be constructive and open-minded in our approaches, because we've seen now, and that's the unfortunate part, the consequence of inaction over the past number of years that I've worked on this issue. So the days, as Ali mentioned, of having the same debate in different times is over. It's over. We need to really take a much deeper look and really reinvent the way that we think about policy the way that we think about wins, and that would also go hand in hand for the state level, and how different electoral races end up shaking up across that map as well.
Thank you, Juan. And I'm going to pass it to Sandy Close. But before I do, I want to tell my colleagues to please come back next week, because we're going to have a postmortem analysis of the elections with some very good speakers. So don't miss next week's briefing. Sandy.
Well, I just want to say that for so many of our ethnic media colleagues, immigration is not a newsbeat. It's the air we breathe. And what you've done by opening up our thinking, by sharing your thinking, for all of the pessimism, it's been a breath of fresh air. It has truly been inspiring. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll be back. We're in this for the long haul. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.